The 1804 Consortium is dedicated to analyzing the various foreign political systems used by African nations through a Maatist lens. We seek to educate global African citizens around the world on the advantages and disadvantages of using foreign political systems to govern themselves. Lastly, we seek to promote the creation and use of indigenous African political systems, such as Maatism, as an alternative to foreign political systems that are derived outside of the African historical, political, and cultural experiences.
Welcome to another edition of the 1804 Consortium. I am your host, Jaja Malik. Today we'll be examining a short clip by Noam Chomsky about racism in America as it pertains to African Americans in particular, but also Native Americans. What we want to do is make African people worldwide understand the importance of using an indigenous African lens to examine our historical, political, and cultural experiences. So thus, it's not that Noam Chomsky's interpretations are inaccurate, but however, looking at things from a Maatist lens, it will provide you a deeper understanding of those events and things that have happened to Africans, Americans here in this country. So sit back and listen, and I'll come in later and give you the Maatist analysis. Thank you.
This is a very racist society. I mean, it's pretty shocking. What has happened in the last roughly 30 years with regard to African Americans actually is very similar to what Maatist describes in the late 19th century. Remember what happened. The constitutional amendments after the Civil War were supposed to free African American slaves. It did something for about 10 years. And then there was a North-South Compact, which essentially granted the former slave-owning states the right to do whatever they wanted. And what they did was criminalize black life in all kinds of ways. And that created a kind of a slave force. In fact, one of the most interesting books on it, Douglas Blackman's, is called Worse Than Slavery or something like that. It threw mostly black males, but also women, into jail, where they become a perfect labor force, much better than slaves. If you're a slave owner, you have to keep your capital alive. If the state does it for you, it's terrific. No strikes, no disobedience, perfect labor force. A lot of the American Industrial Revolution in the late 19th, early 20th century is based on that. Actually, it pretty much lasted until the Second World War, when there was a need for what's called free labor in the war industry. After that come about two decades in which African Americans had a kind of a shot at entering the society. A black worker get a job in an auto plant, the unions were still functioning, maybe buy a small house, send his kid to college or something. By the 1970s or 80s, it's going back to criminalization of black life. It's called the drug war, which is a racist war. Ronald Reagan was an extreme racist, denied it. And the whole drug war, so-called, is designed from policing up to eventual release from prison to make it impossible for the black male community and more women and more Hispanics to be part of the society. In fact, if you look at American history, the first slaves came in 1619, half a millennium. There have been about 3 or 4 decades in which African Americans had a limited degree of freedom. Not entirely, but at least some. Of course, it's for black elites, there's some privileges, but I'm talking about the mass of the population, which has been recriminalized and incidentally also turned into a slave labor force. There's prison labor, for example. Well, this is American history. To break out of that is no small trick. In fact, if you take a look at the election, say the last election, in many ways it's the Civil War of the red states of the Confederacy. Extends a little beyond, but that's pretty much what it is. And of course, this is a real battle. These two founding crimes, slavery and extermination of the indigenous population, they're very much with us. Take a look at Indian reservations today. It's not a pretty.
After listening to Noam Chomsky's interpretation of those events, the violence and the genocide that has occurred that have been endured by Africans, Americans, and Native Americans in this country, it's important that we begin to see those events from a systematic point of view. And so we can get a greater picture of what is really going on. So even though he talks about racism, the larger picture from us through a Maatist lens is that America has, African Americans represent an internal colony within the dominant society. So it's actually, that colony is a system. A system, when looked upon as a system, it explains not just the racist aspect of it, it explains the economic exploitation of it, it explains the cultural domination of it, it explains the racism, the institutional racism, the systematic racism, it explains the violence towards African Americans, it explains the media, the use of how media is used to reinforce these inferiority beliefs about African Americans, and it explains why African Americans are not being educated in this country. So it explains all of this. So part of the Maatism is understanding how internal and external forces within a system will continue to tend towards entropy unless there's an input of orderly energy into the system. And when carefully manipulated, you can introduce energy into a system to keep it barely afloat from totally collapsing into anarchy. Or you can introduce energy into that system where all of a sudden more order is evident within that system. So if we take, say, an inner city or a ghetto, and it's very chaotic, very disordered, but if you introduce grants, if you allow people to have access to quality jobs, if you improve the education in the so-called ghetto or inner city, you will begin to see that it will be less and less disorder, meaning the level of crime, the level of violence, the level of drug use, and all of those things will tend to decrease as this positive or energy or orderly energy is inputted into the system. And so thus, as an internal colony, African Americans are used accordingly to the whims of the dominant group, which are Caucasians. So it is exploited in various ways, and it is dominated by the dominant culture. They control and manipulate our culture as they see fit. They introduce values and things and beliefs into our culture that were not there before, and they, over periods of time, make those beliefs acceptable. They routinely ensure that Africans, Americans, in their internal colony experience levels of violence to create fear among the masses of African people, et cetera, et cetera. So we go on and on. So it's important that we understand that. So racism is just a tool that the dominant group uses to maintain and control the internal colony, which is the African American in this country represent an internal colony, and so do Native Americans. And this is why when you look at Native Americans on reservations and African Americans that are living in ghettos or in the projects, you see the similar symptoms. So you're going to see a lot of drug use and alcohol use and a lot of violence and divorce. You will see similar characteristics of both groups. And the reason why you see those similarities is that both groups are internal colonies. They're in and of themselves, they are systems that are being manipulated and controlled by the dominant society. So whereas Noam Chomsky is focusing just on racism and looking at that, racism is just one aspect, one tool that is used by the dominant group to control the subordinate group or internal colony, in this case, African Americans and Native Americans.